In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. 6 Sundays have passed since we heard the news that Jesus was raised from the dead. We have heard many stories this Easter, accounts of how Jesus appeared to his disciples. Mary Magdalene found his tomb empty that Sunday morning after Passover, and then she saw him in the garden. And on Sunday afternoon, there were the 2 followers who saw him on the road when they were walking to Emmaus. They didn't recognize him at first, but when they arrived at their destination, he came into their house and sat down to eat supper with them. And he lifted up the bread and broke it, just the same way as he always did. And suddenly they knew it was him. And Thomas actually touched him, put his hand into the spear wound on his side. Even though they thought he was dead, Jesus was alive and with them, and they could see him and hear him and touch him. But today marks the end of Jesus being with his followers in this way. Today, the feast of the Ascension, Jesus took his inner circle out to Bethany, which is just outside the city walls, the place where Mary and Martha lived, the place where Jesus raised their brother Lazarus from the dead. And here, in Bethany, Jesus told them the time had come, and that they should remember and keep telling all the people in Jerusalem and beyond the good news that he had taught. And then he raised his hands and blessed them. And while he was blessing them, he was carried into heaven, gone, just like that. Imagine how abandoned they must have felt, just like many in our world today. It's tempting to ignore the story of the Ascension, especially in a post-Enlightenment world. It's hard to argue for the credibility of such an account when it's set against what we know to be true about how the world works. The world is not flat. Heaven is not the realm above our heads just beyond the clouds. And what's the point of having Jesus float up and away like that? But maybe there's another possibility. Maybe the story is not in opposition to the facts that science has revealed to us about quantum mechanics and general relativity and molecular biology. Maybe taking this story literally misses the point altogether. Maybe it is trying to point us towards something bigger, towards meaning and truth with a capital T. And this kind of truth isn't easy to find in the world we live in. Today, the Ascension of Jesus speaks to our COVID-19 world and to a new reality waiting to be born. The corona pandemic has shown the church to be very vulnerable. How can we be the church if we cannot meet in community and celebrate and receive the sacraments? And even when this lockdown ends, it is unlikely that we will be able to gather as the people of God for many weeks to come. And this is going to have a massive impact on the post-pandemic church. If the church is to remain relevant, then it needs to reform. We know from Acts and the letters of Paul that the early church met in the houses of the disciples. Perhaps we need to go back to this model. And this is already happening. Shortly before the lockdown, I read that the Orthodox Archbishop of Athens had told the people of Athens that for as long as they could not worship in their churches, they were to turn their homes into churches, with prayer as the central focus. Regular prayer at set times even very brief ones, before dinner or bedtime, is a good place to start. If you aren't already doing it, now is the time to start. If you are, then that's a solid platform to build other devotions on. I've also been very encouraged by the many private masses that are being said every day in homes around the world. Intentions are being remembered. The sacrifice is being offered. The vital spiritual work of the church is continuing. Sometimes it is being recorded on an iPhone or streamed on social media. Most of the world doesn't even know that it's going on, but it is. And this is why our world will be remade and our church will survive, in part because of a largely anonymous band of priests who spend quiet moments before small tables and altars, blessing and breaking bread and praying for the world. But why did Jesus lead his disciples out to Bethany to say their final goodbyes? Bethany was where he often stayed when visiting Jerusalem. Jesus chose to spend a lot of time in this village where his friends Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus lived. But Bethany wasn't a very nice neighborhood. It was outside the city walls, just out of sight of the temple. The name Bethany translates into something like the house of affliction. It was where the city of Jerusalem sent people who were poor or sick. There was a homeless shelter there and a leper hospital. Bethany was built out of sight of the temple so that those coming into the city to worship wouldn't have to see all that ugliness, all that poverty, all that desperation. But that is precisely where Jesus chose to spend much of his time. These are the people Jesus chose to spend his time with. He poured out his life in love for them. And Bethany is the last place on earth Jesus chose to be seen among the poor and the suffering. This is the truth of today's Ascension for us as we consider a post-COVID-19 church. The truth that Jesus ascended from that place of affliction into every place and time, carrying with him the cares and concerns of all the poor people of the earth. And now he surrounds and infiltrates all times and all places with this truth, a truth sometimes hidden just under the surface, but always there if you're willing to face it. The truth that real love costs everything you have, and it's the only thing that matters. In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.